Imagine a place where staying was never meant to be temporary. Patients guided by hope and promise that one day they will return home happy and healthy. A structure frozen in time, shaped by disease, death, and long uncertainty. When night falls, all explanation begins to fail. Noises fade, boundaries soften, true isolation takes over. This episode is about what remains inside these walls and what refuses to settle into reason. I'm Johnny Clash. I'm a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a paranormal enthusiast. I believe there is something out there, something we do not fully understand. But I'm not here to prove anything or tear it apart. I'm here to observe, to explore, and to look closely at what happens when expectation meets the unknown. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Waverly Hills Sanatorium is one of the most famous paranormal locations in America. Known for its reputation, its imagery, and decades of stories tied to illness, death, and confinement. The base of these tales originate from long lists of documented trauma centered around tuberculosis. But what's inside this building is much more prominent now than it ever was. Waverly Hills was not built for visitors. It was built to hold people in place with a dividing line. Sick on one side, really sick on the other. To separate them from the outside world and measure their lives in charts, routines, and quiet hours, hoping they one day make it out. But unfortunately, most did not. During the day, the structure is readable. You move through rooms knowing you will leave. At night, that logic collapses. Corridors stretch longer than expected. Sounds travel further than they should. Silence feels active rather than empty. This is where many of the stories, legends, and evidence takes shape. Not during moments staged for fear, but during the hours when nothing was supposed to happen at all. That inconsistency is the point. This is episode 2, Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a place designed for permanence and remembered for what can never be contained. Unlike the Stanley Hotel, which is not tied to a series of horrific events leading to its paranormal identity, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium has a deep background of recorded legacy. The land now known as Waverly Hills was originally purchased in 1883 by Major Thomas H. Hayes as a family home. Because the area was far from existing schools, Hayes opened a small one-room classroom for his daughters, naming it Waverly Schools after Walter Scott's Waverly novels. He later adapted the same name for the property itself, and when the Tuberculosis Board purchased the land during the worldwide pandemic, they kept it. The well-known sanatorium sits on a wooded hillside outside Louisville, Kentucky, originally built in 1910 as tuberculosis was at its highest, and sanatoriums were used as quarantine zones all around the country. At the time, tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death in the United States, and isolation was considered the only effective form of treatment. As cases increased, the facility expanded rapidly, eventually becoming a massive 5-story complex designed to house hundreds of patients at once, far removed from the city below. Life inside Waverly Hills followed strict routines meant to preserve both order and morale. Patients were encouraged to spend time outdoors, eat regularly, and participate in music and social activities when possible. A little bit of normalcy. Despite these efforts, the reality of the disease was unavoidable. Mortality rates were high, treatments were experimental, and many patients spent months or years confined to the building until their number was ultimately called. To manage the constant presence of death, a tunnel was constructed beneath the hospital to discreetly transport bodies away from patient areas. A practical decision that will later become one of the most referenced features in its legend, and one we will cover here in just a little bit. By the 1920s, the original Waverly Hills building was struggling. Wooden structures needed constant repair. The hospital required a more durable design, and there simply weren't enough beds for patients. Construction of a new 5-story building began in March of 1924, designed to hold over 400 patients. It finally opened on October 17, 1926, and served as a tuberculosis hospital until the introduction of streptomycin in 1943, gradually reducing the cases. But by June of 1961, the need for such a large facility had ended, and remaining patients were transferred to Hazelwood Sanatorium, also in Louisville. Now, with tuberculosis finally under control, the building reopened as Woodhaven Geriatric Center in 1962, a nursing home for aging patients with dementia, limited mobility, and severe mental disabilities. Unfortunately, the facility was overcrowded and understaffed, leading to repeated reports of neglect. Because of this, the state of Kentucky closed Woodhaven in 1980, leaving the 5-story structure without a proper tenant for the first time in nearly 40 years. The building went through several ownership changes and redevelopment plans over the next decades, when in 1983, a developer proposed converting it into a minimum security prison, but the plan was dropped after local protests. Later, there was a proposal to turn it into apartments, but those plans failed in 1996 when Robert Alberhaysky purchased the property and aimed to build a massive Christ the Redeemer-inspired statue on the roof, along with an arts and worship center. Despite his ambitious plans to build the world's largest statue of Jesus Christ, the project never received enough funding and was canceled by 1997. Now, after a few years in limbo, Tina and Charlie Mattingly purchased what was once Waverly Hills in 2001. They run historical and paranormal tours, as well as public investigations of the once overrun building. Each Halloween, a haunted house takes shape, and what better place to host the attraction? Currently, they are working on restoring the windows and interior, preserving the building while keeping its haunted legacy alive. Now, as I mentioned before, beneath Waverly Hills lies a network of service tunnels, the most famous of which was built to carry steam, coal, and other supplies between the heating plant at the bottom of the hill and the main sanatorium building. These tunnels were a vital part of the hospital's operations, allowing staff to move heavy materials efficiently without disrupting daily patient care. The tunnel system included a small cable car designed to transport items up and down the incline, reducing the physical strain on workers and speeding deliveries. Over time, these tunnels became an essential, though largely unseen, part of the sanatorium's daily life, supporting everything from laundry and food deliveries to maintenance work. Now, during a brief period between 1920 and 1940s, the tunnel took on a much darker function. Also called or referred to as the death chutes, stories claim they were used to discreetly transport the bodies of deceased patients down to ambulances waiting at the bottom of the hill. This process was meant to spare other patients from the immediate knowledge of yet another death in the building, trying to keep morale up. Because the tunnels were never open to the public and largely unmonitored, they became a source of legend over the years. Visitors and investigators have long reported strange sounds, like footsteps, and the feeling of being watched when exploring these underground passages. The stories add a layer of tension and mystery as the tunnels connect the hospital's practical history with its darker reputation. Even today, the tunnels are part of Waverly Hills' allure. They represent a link to the hospital's past, from the daily logistics of running a sanatorium to the ways the staff tried to manage death quietly and efficiently. For paranormal enthusiasts, they remain one of the most compelling and chilling parts of the property, a place where history and legend overlap in ways that are impossible to fully separate. The tunnels have also inspired modern storytelling. In 2006, the American horror film Death Tunnel was filmed on location, using the tunnels as its chilling backdrop. The film opens with a dedication: "To all the lost souls of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, may you find your way home." This nod to the real history of the sanatorium reinforces how the tunnels themselves have become symbolic, not just for practical use, but for the lingering presence and stories of those who lived and those who died. Now, Waverly Hills did not begin as a place of fear. As I just spoke about, the intention behind the sanatorium was meant for good. Sanatoriums like this were built not to hide the sick, but to save them. Fresh air, sunlight, rest, and isolation were all considered medicine, and the woodsy hillside was the perfect location. The building's elevation and isolation were not ominous choices, they were rooted in hope, much like we saw with Freeland Oscar Stanley and the Stanley Hotel. Yes, there were tests done inside Waverly Hills that today would be considered inhumane and impractical, but in the early 1900s, it provided the only hope a doctor would need. Patients would sometimes undergo artificial pneumothorax procedures, easy for me to say, which would replace a partially collapsed lung with a balloon. Or patients could also have lymph nodes removed, electroshock therapy, or the most extreme and painful treatment, thoracoplasty, which involved removing up to 8 ribs. But the cultural shift began slowly, and it began with the progress mentioned earlier with the introduction of antibiotics, specifically streptomycin, dramatically reducing tuberculosis deaths. Waverly Hills corridors empty not because of tragedy, but because medicine had finally caught up. As the building's needs decreased, its structure and purpose began to erode. Entire wings were closed off. Floors that once held beds and staff fell completely silent. The rhythms that had defined the hospital for decades just disappeared. This was not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual quieting. And quiet, in a building designed to be full of human movement, has a way of changing how a place feels. Absence creates space for interpretation. The hospital had not become sinister, but it had become unfamiliar. Now, when Waverly Hills closed as a tuberculosis hospital, it marked a critical psychological turning point. The building was no longer associated with healing, even imperfect healing. It was now a relic of an era people wanted to forget. Tuberculosis had carried stigma and long suffering. Closing the hospital didn't erase those associations, it froze them in place. What remained was a massive structure now filled with memories, but no longer anchored to a clear function. The reopening of the building as Woodhaven Geriatric Center deepened the shift. Unlike the sanatorium era, Woodhaven quickly developed the troubled reputation we spoke of earlier. While not all stories were verified, the perception mattered. Public trust in the institution weakened. This was no longer a place framed as necessary medical refuge. It became a place people felt uneasy about, even during its operation. The building absorbed that unease and continued its legacy of negativity in the preceding years. When Woodhaven inevitably closed, the transformation was complete. Waverly Hills was now abandoned, and abandonment changes narrative faster than almost anything else. Nature reclaimed parts of the structure. Windows broke, hallways decayed, snakes and spiders run through those tunnels which once transported the dead. Without context, the building began to look like what people expected a haunted place to look like. The suffering associated with tuberculosis blended with later allegations, neglect stories, silence. Time compressed decades of unrelated events into a single emotional memory. The building simply remained behind to carry that weight. By the time pop culture and paranormal investigations arrived, the groundwork had already been laid. The hospital's medical history was no longer the focus. The fear of disease, isolation, and death had been repackaged as fear of the unknown and questions like, who still walks these halls? That is the true cultural shift here. Not a single moment of violence, not a single tragedy, but a slow redefinition of purpose, memory, and meaning. Waverly Hills became a staple of early 2000s paranormal television, appearing on shows like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, Most Haunted, and Paranormal Lockdown. These shows framed the building as one of the most active and dangerous haunted locations in the United States. Thermal anomalies, EVPs, shadow figures, and the emotional reactions from investigators were framed into compelling narratives that emphasized intensity over ambiguity. A simple Google search or YouTube search of Waverly Hills evidence will show you many unexplained anomalies taken over the years, and not just by these television shows. Now, while these shows remain the focal point, and while some are skeptical of the results, you can't deny what they caught. On Ghost Hunters, which visited Waverly Hills multiple times, the TAPS team documented striking visual evidence. During their visits in Season 2 and later in the rebooted version, investigators captured thermal footage of what appeared to be multiple shadowy figures moving through hallways, with no one visible on conventional cameras. Investigators later witnessed a ball placed in a corridor roll on its own with no noticeable draft or human contact, adding to the mystery. And like we mentioned before, just a quick YouTube search and you will find many EVPs and disembodied voices that pair with what ghost hunters found on television. Now, other shows like Most Haunted emphasized visual phenomena. The crew reported shadow figures moving at the end of the corridor and sudden feelings of dizziness or nausea among investigators while filming. At times, doors appeared to move without visible cause and crew members reacted to perceived touches or pressure. Now, Ghost Adventures took a more aggressive approach, as they always do. Zach Baggins, Nick Groff, and Aaron Goodwin dove straight in using full spectrum and night vision cameras. The team reported black apparitions moving down the hallway and physical sensations of pressure and lethargy, especially when Zach laid inside the old morgue cooler, where he described feeling overwhelmingly drained and compelled to leave the area. In addition, the crew referenced local lore about shadow entities and doppelgangers thought to be active in the building and set up spirit boxes and EMF devices that they claimed produced fragmented responses and unexplained equipment activity during their overnight stay. Now, millions of viewers encountered Waverly Hills for the first time through this lens, and then through the internet. For many, their initial understanding of the site did not come from medical history, but from night vision footage and dramatic narration. I guess like this one. This reframed the building from the former hospital into an active paranormal hotspot once again. And while we know the death toll was high, pop culture frequently repeats inflated or incorrect numbers associated with Waverly Hills, often citing deaths in the tens of thousands without context. These figures are rarely sourced and almost never adjusted for the decades the hospital operated or the realities of early 20th century tuberculosis care. The range of patients' deaths is said to be somewhere between 6 to 60,000, a dramatically wide range, though the real documented number may be closer to 8 to 10,000. We may never know the true number, but regardless, the death toll is still staggering. These high numbers suggest overwhelming tragedy and make the hauntings feel inevitable. The repetition of these claims across shows, blogs, and documentaries has cemented them in public memory, even when historians dispute their accuracy. And if the attention from television wasn't enough, Waverly Hills once played house to the sounds of the Underground Music Festival. This was the last stop of the tour in 2007, featuring bands like Lamb of God, Guar, Hatebreed, Chimera, Shadows Fall, The Acacia Strain, and Job for a Cowboy, with surprise guest Behemoth. What's cooler than a heavy metal concert with some of the most popular names in the genre headbanging inside an abandoned sanatorium? I'm in. Much of Waverly Hills lore centers on the upper floors, particularly the 4th and 5th, which were once patient wards. However, you still may see the doctor in his white coat entering a patient's room, or the hospital's chef still in the kitchen with the smell of freshly baked bread guiding you to his ovens. Shadowy figures are said to glide along the hallways, appearing for only a moment before vanishing into the walls. Guests and investigators report fleeting glimpses of movement in darkened corners, the sensation of being watched, and cold spots that seem to shift unpredictably. Some even see a woman running towards them with cut wrists, screaming. And this isn't limited to just the investigators you see on TV. Most of the evidence is caught during public investigations on the property. These encounters are often framed as residual energy, which are imprints left behind by those who endured the sanatorium's harsh conditions. Visitors also recount auditory phenomena that adds to the building's eerie reputation. Echoes of coughing, crying, and the shuffling of footsteps down empty corridors are frequently reported, especially late at night when the building is quiet. I just got goosebumps on my arm. Some claim these sounds are the remnants of tuberculosis patients frozen in time and stuck in a loop of repeating their final painful moments of life. Others describe whispers, disembodied voices, and the occasional distant scream. experiences that cannot easily be verified yet persist in the retellings that surround Waverly Hills. Each report builds on the narrative that the hospital itself holds memory, replaying suffering for those who entered and didn't make it out. While the actual death count is in question, 2 documented and kind of recent deaths did occur on the property after the sanatorium was abandoned. One man was beaten to death at the hands of drug dealers in one of the most horrific deaths the property has ever seen. The other, a man fell down the elevator shaft alongside his dog while taking a stroll through the halls. Now, this would explain the encounter current owner Tina Mattingly has reported, as she saw a man and his dog walking around when locking up one night after a tour. Though most encounters are brief, the most common anomaly is an entity known as the Creeper. The Creeper is a large shadow figure that has been spotted climbing the walls and the ceiling of the 4th floor, but can vanish in the blink of an eye. Many have captured what they believe to be the Creeper when taking photos here. Doppelgangers may also be the scariest entity roaming around at night. Visitors will see a version of themselves in the dark hallways, but doppelgangers are often seen as an omen of bad luck or impending death, so maybe try to avoid that one if you can. Now, while the volume of death at Waverly Hills certainly left a mark on the collective imagination, the real history of Waverly Hills paints a far more grounded picture than the legend suggests. When thinking about tuberculosis patients and even the geriatric center to follow, we often forget that children were not immune to this deadly disease and play a significant role in Waverly Hills lore. Legends speak of a young boy named Timmy whose story is still stuck in the building's infinite loop. Timmy was a patient at the sanatorium during the early 20th century. In the stories passed down through tours and ghost hunting accounts, Timmy is depicted as a playful spirit who roams the hallways, sometimes leaving small, tangible reminders of his presence. Guests have reported hearing a child laughing in empty corridors or feeling a tap on the shoulder when no one is near, experiences attributed to his restless, childlike energy. While that might sound great to investigators looking to capture some fun evidence, the real story behind Timmy is far more tragic than the playful ghost legend suggests. Records indicate that he was indeed a young patient who spent significant time in the upper floors of the hospital, where most of the severe cases were treated. Like many children at Waverly Hills, Timmy endured isolation, limited contact with his family, and the harsh realities of a disease and the thought that he will never make it home. His death was recorded in hospital logs, and it's believed he succumbed to the complications from tuberculosis, though specific details about his life and family remain minimal. The lack of comprehensive records has allowed folklore to fill in the gaps, transforming Timmy into the spectral figure known today. Despite the tragic reality, Timmy's story has taken on a life of its own in modern ghost lore. Many visitors leave small tokens for him, like toys or coins, believed to attract his spirit. You might even roll a ball on the 4th floor, and it might just roll back to you. In this way, Timmy exists in 2 realms: the documented history of a child who suffered and died in the sanatorium, and the legend of a spirit whose presence continues to captivate the imaginations of those who walk Waverly Hills' empty halls at night. If you ever visit, you might spot those tokens left beneath the upper floor's window, hoping Timmy makes an appearance. So what makes Waverly Hills feel the most uneasy is that nothing fully settles into place. The building responds differently to different people, under different conditions, with no clear rules governing the outcome. Rather than weakening the mystery, these inconsistencies strengthen it. They suggest a place that does not perform on command and refuses to behave the way a haunted location is expected to. For decades, Waverly Hills was a place of routine, but one of the most overlooked elements is how long the building functioned as an active medical center compared to how long it has existed in ruin. The majority of the building's life was structured, repetitive, and controlled. That normalcy is rarely acknowledged, even though it shaped the environment far more than the brief moments of crisis that dominate the legend. Another missing piece is how profoundly the environment affects perception. Waverly Hills sits isolated on a hill, removed from the surrounding neighborhoods, security at the gates with limited natural light once inside. Long corridors, identical rooms, and heavy concrete construction distort sound and depth perception. At night, with minimal lighting and little external reference, the brain fills the gaps aggressively. This does not invalidate any experience, but it does reframe them. Sensations feel amplified, not because something is present, but because the setting strips away grounded cues that people unconsciously rely on. Finally, Waverly Hills is often treated as frozen in its darkest moment, when in reality it has passed through multiple identities: hospital, nursing home, abandoned structure, failed redevelopment site, and now a tourist destination. Don't forget about concert hall. Each phase altered how the building was used, modified, and remembered. Paranormal claims are often attributed to the sanatorium era alone, even when they originated decades later. Ignoring these transitions simplifies the story, but it also erases the context that might explain why the experiences feel fragmented, inconsistent, and unresolved. What if that large statue of Jesus Christ was built at this location? Would anything inside change? What if? Many places known for hauntings lose their power once their stories settle into something predictable. Once expectations are set and outcomes feel rehearsed, the mystery thins out. Waverly Hills never reached that point. Its reputation endures not because it delivers the same experience, but because it fails to do so. So sure, you may book a tour and experience an apparition or even a shadow figure. The proof is there, but the reality is you may experience nothing at all. Maybe just some spiders or snakes occupying the building where a deadly disease once ran rampant. We want beginnings, causes, names, and rules that explain why something happens and when it will happen again. Waverly Hills provides fragments of that with familiar figures but skewed numbers. Stories that fit neatly into tours and retellings. They give form to the experience and make it even easier to talk about. But beyond those anchors are moments that never fully crystallize. Experiences that resist being shaped into a clean narrative. They do not resolve the question. They keep it open. That unpredictability is not a failure of the story. It's the reason the story continues. In the next episode, we move to a place where arrival wasn't voluntary. Not for rest, not for healing, but for punishment. A structure built to isolate rather than observe, shaped by silence, surveillance, and long hours spent alone. Eastern State Penitentiary. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. Thanks for listening.
Paranormal Unsettled is written and produced by Johnny Clash. Want more unsettling content? Subscribe to Johnny Clash XP on YouTube and Paranormal Unsettled on TikTok. For gaming content, follow on Twitch and social media at Johnny FN Clash.